The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's webinar, Mastering FDA Computer System Audits, Best Practice for Preparation, brought to you by Webinar Planet. This webinar will be presented by our industry expert, Carolyn Troiano, and it will be recorded to purchase later in a form of DVD, flash drive, transcript, and digital download. If you wish to ask any question during the webinar, kindly type them in the question box and they will be answered by our speaker during our question and answer session. Carolyn, welcome to the program. We are now ready to begin.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Carolyn Troiano, and we're going to be talking about how to master FDA Computer System Audits, the best practices to prepare for this. We'll cover FDA regulatory oversight and what we mean by GXPs. We'll cover some inspection trends, some regulatory influences. This will give you an idea of where to focus your efforts to make sure you can remediate anything before they come. Then we'll get into computer system validation, planning, execution, operations, and maintenance to keep your system in a validated state. We'll cover 21 CFR Part 11, electronic records and signatures, data integrity requirements, and then the policies and procedures needed to support your effort. And finally, we'll talk about actually executing the audit and how to manage it and prepare for it ahead of time. Finally, we'll recap and have a Q&A. So everything is based on predicate rules from FDA, the GXPs, where X is a variable. So if you have operational areas that are manufacturing, laboratory, or clinical, these are areas regulated by FDA and they are GXP areas. Any IT or automated system, an IT system being an application software package a user interacts with, or an automated system used to monitor or control a piece of equipment, an instrument, or a process. Any of these used in one of these key operational areas that touches your product, meaning you're using the system to collect, analyze, report, transmit, or in any way process FDA-regulated data, then the system is GXP and must be validated according to the agency requirements. These are examples of some of the systems you might find in your GXP areas, but note that any interfaces or points of integration of systems must be accounted for. So if you interface two GXP systems, both must be equivalently validated, and the interface must be validated as well. Now, companies have a lot of good reason for meeting compliance guidelines. There's a focus on customer safety, product quality, and data integrity. The company will also benefit with efficient business operations because you'll be doing things right the first time, not having to spend a lot of unnecessary time responding and investigating issues. It'll also promote good relations with FDA and other agencies and provide a positive image and reputation for your company. Note that if you get a Form 483 citation for out of compliance during inspection, the FDA.gov website does not post all Form 483s, but they do offer a sampling of them. And you can get a paid subscription to all Form 483s through other providers on the internet. The warning letters and the consent decrees that are issued by FDA are in full stored in the FDA.gov website. You can see every warning letter and every consent decree. And so your competitors, your customers, anyone can see that information. And the FDA operates on key premises. If you didn't document something, you didn't do it. You must have documented evidence. And if you could have committed fraud, even if there's an opportunity to commit fraud, they will assume you did commit fraud. So if you have a database record and no audit trail on it to show all the changes that are made, you're going to obscure original data. You're going to not have a complete history of what happened to that piece of data or document throughout its life cycle. And so the FDA will assume that with the opportunity to commit fraud, they will indicate that you did commit fraud. You don't have any way around that. And if you don't adhere to a policy or procedure, it must be documented as a deviation with an explanation that's justified. Otherwise, you're going to be out of compliance. With FDA, there's no recourse. You're innocent until proven guilty in a U.S. court of law, but with FDA, you're guilty until you prove your innocence through your documentation. They can issue fines, confiscate materials and products, and shut down operations. Schering-Plough Pharmaceutical found this out when they were issued a consent decree in 1998. Now, this is an example from 25 years ago. There have been many since then, but this one cost $500 million, $500 million in fines 25 years ago. They had to shut down more than one plant, and it took them about 10 years to recover. They never actually recovered. In 2010, they were so vulnerable, they were taken over by Merck Sharp and Dohme. So you can see the impact on the bottom line of the company. And FDA has many tools available to them to engage stakeholders, regulatory meetings, Form 43 citations during an on-site inspection, warning letters, consent decrees, import alerts, injunctions, seizures, and untitled letters. With the Investigations Operation Manual for FDA inspectors, an observation is defined as when the investigator, in their judgment, conditions or practices observed indicate that product has been adulterated or may become adulterated or rendered injurious to health. Now, the word judgment is very important here. It's subjective. They have to be able to observe specific conditions that they can point to and describe in order to make that judgment and explain why. If they don't see something, they can't cite you for it. They must have hard evidence that determines that you are at fault. When you don't respond to a Form 43 citation in a timely manner or effectively, or even if the issues are so egregious that they go beyond what would be in a 483, you can get issued a warning letter, the escalation from a 483. It's an official correspondence going to the CEO of the company identifying serious violations. It's published on FDA.gov, and anyone else can see it, your customers, your business, competitors, and the media. Now, note that the Food and Drug Administration's Safety and Innovation Act was passed in 2012. This is important because it says that the FDA now has a right to deem adulterated any product that you've manufactured, processed, or packed, held in any factory, warehouse, or establishment, and the owner, operator, or agent of such an establishment delays, denies, limits inspection, or refuses entry to do inspection. So if they come to the door, you must let them in, or they will deem every product adulterated. Recent warning letters show a trend toward data integrity issues, where companies are being found to have a lack of control over access to systems, not recording data or entering information contemporaneous with the act. So once you perform an activity or observe an event, you must record the values immediately. Deletion, falsification, alteration, and other manipulation. And also your supply chain people. So anyone you have contract with, contract manufacturers, repackers, relabelers, any of these companies must be held. You must hold them to the same standard FDA holds you to. And the trends show an enormous increase in data integrity issues, along with rudimentary CGXP issues. And that's one puzzle to FDA, because for the last 10 years, they've been seeing this happen, where all of a sudden companies are getting sloppy and not meeting what is required. Here we see warning letters with specific data integrity citations, 2013 to 18. You see the increase in the trend from 13 to 18 for both warning letters and citations of warning letters with data integrity issues. So data deficiencies continue to increase, but there have been no new requirements issued by FDA since 2003. And again, another example of data integrity issue where companies not putting appropriate controls over computers and related systems, making sure master production and control record changes are only done by authorized personnel. And again, that increasing trend is alarming to FDA. And a similar one where companies are being cited for not having complete data derived from all tests, examinations, and assays necessary to assure compliance with established specifications and standards. Again, we see an alarming increase. Here we see software and computer warning letters based on topic. from 2014 to 16, and it shows 79% of the issues relate to validation, data retention, security audit trails, and data integrity. Now, during COVID, there was a trend where a lot of the inspections were done remotely in 2020 and 2021. So you see far fewer warning letters issued during that period. There were fewer inspections done. And so now in 2022, last year, this started to come back. And for 2023, they are back to doing on-site inspections. And the question came up, would they adopt widespread remote inspection? And that hasn't really been answered, or at least while travel is open, the FDA has not said we're going to do more remote inspections. They haven't really put forward any kind of strategy. They're still focusing on mission critical work, trying to dig into a backlog of 23,297 cases that were in the backlog through the end of 2021. And the government put some pressure on them to release $257 million in increased funding in July of 2021 to use. Half of it was to be used for increased inspections, the other half for innovation of data, artificial intelligence, and other emerging technologies to improve the regulatory process. Now, FDA put forth in 2019 a Technology Modernization Action Plan, TMAP. This was an approach to overhaul all of their infrastructure, to break down the silos of activity within FDA, to make systems more interoperable, to govern data better. And so they are also expecting industry to do the same, to make sure they are using newer technologies and improving the regulatory process as a result. These are citations that are specific to 21 CFR Part 11, the Electronic Records and Signatures Guidance by FDA. From 2008 to 2020 by reason, the reasons listed on the right-hand side of the screen with the colored boxes. Now, up until 2016, up till 2015, I should say, most of the inspections done were procedural. They looked at SOPs, for example. They really weren't very well trained in Part 11 at the FDA. The inspectors came in and performed very cursory reviews up until 2015. But starting in 2016, and you'll see in 2020, they were hitting on all of the various reasons why you might be out of compliance. And that indicates they've had the training and they now know what questions to ask and what to look for. And if we look at recalls, they are hit heavily with devices in particular, because a lot of medical devices today include software that works in conjunction with them or controls the device. And so a lot of these medical device companies are outsourcing that software development to firms that are technically experts, but they don't know how to manage the system development life cycle of the software that they're developing and providing to these medical device companies. As a result, they're following a quick process of, for example, incrementing, I should say, improving the system, giving new functionality incrementally, small increments. They're changing things. But what happens is they're adding a function at the same time they're not testing fully through regression testing that the rest of the software wasn't harmed. So they put in one feature and the next thing you know, the system breaks. Because of that, a lot of device failures happened. And what they found was about 80% of device failures where software was involved, it was because someone simply made a software patch and they didn't do it properly. So FDA is trying to work with industry to come to an agreement on standards for software development, testing, and support. Now, this shows the various warning letters, import alerts being issued by FDA. And note that any of the companies that are in the life science industry, anything regulated by FDA, these products are subject to counterfeit activity. And counterfeit activity, the revenue from that generally goes to support terrorism around the world. As a result, the Customs and Border Protection, Homeland Security, FDA are working together through the Customs and Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, CTPAT. This is a voluntary organization, but if you go through the process of making sure your supply chain is secure, then you can get a certain status which will let you get product moved through the country much faster. If we look at citations in general, these are for pharmaceutical industry 483s. And you'll see, and this is really the time frame is not important. It's really just to show there is a trend where it decreases over a couple of years, then it increases, then it decreases. And this is because there are many factors going into what FDA is faced with every time they're doing inspections. Trend. So here, it just shows FDA at any point in time is doing more or less inspection. They are finding more or less things out there. So the trends are very telling. But the areas most at risk during inspection, and these are really key areas to prepare for when you're going to be inspected. For your computer system, security and access, testing and validation, training and expertise, and documentation. With security and access, findings where people are having more lax practices about security and access. People are sharing their user IDs, their passwords, their accounts. People don't have good rigor around electronic record and signature security. Users are given more access than needed to perform their role. Access should be role-based, and the role should define what access privileges are required. Change control not in place for system components when they undergo a change. Audit trails compromised, taking them offline or deactivating them or deleting them without an explanation. Segregation of duties not always ensured or clear. So the risk and consequences, you're not able then to verify who performed an activity. Electronic records and signatures could be subject to risk of loss or compromise to authenticity and validity. And users that are performing roles without the proper qualifications or training are going to end up having that data disqualified. And not being able to identify who made changes to data or documentation, when they were made or for what reason, that ends up being fraud, and you will be assumed to have committed fraud. Potential opportunity for fraud compromises all the related data and documentation. With testing and validation, some companies are not doing validation, insufficient validation, not having the right level of documentation, not testing sufficiently, not tracing requirements to all of your test scripts, and not having your standard operating procedures updated. And with testing and validation, the risks and consequences are that data and documentation may be invalidated. So you're going to lose time and money because data will be discarded and you'll have to redo the work. Users performing work incorrectly, again, the data is discounted and you've lost time and money. With training and expertise, not making training mandatory or enforcing that. Internal staff not fully trained in supporting the system in a validated state throughout its life. That's the technical people responsible for the system. If it's a vendor, it's the point of contact at your company who works with the vendor and holds them accountable. People may rely heavily on a third-party contractor or someone who is not on site to be responsible for system validation maintenance and not vet those people or know whether or not they're adequately trained. And when users are given a new system, they may be used to using, for example, a spreadsheet for the last 20 years that worked well for them, and they were comfortable with it. They don't want to go to a new system in some cases. And so some of those users will actually use both systems during their work in the beginning, at least, when the system is put in place. They'll have two sets of books, making it difficult to determine which is the system or data of record for making decisions. And internal auditors, your quality people, not fluent in validation, how you do it in your company. Training records not current, not reflecting skills required for a user to be authorized to perform a role. The risk and consequences, internal staff not fully trained in how to use the system because not enough people came to the training. Internal staff who are supporting the system in a validated state, not fully trained. System not maintained in a validated state. Decisions may be invalidated because you can't defend them to FDA based on what records you have. Internal auditors and quality, not able to serve the organization effectively if they don't understand validation. And training records not current, not including the required skills to qualify them to perform a role. With documentation, not doing a risk assessment of your system as you do your validation. And then once you come up with an overall system risk rating for your system, you must have a complete list of all your GXP systems and applications prioritized by risk. So say you're using high, medium, low as your risk rating. The systems should be listed in a matrix with at least 2 columns, one having the name of the system and application, and the second column having the actual risk rating that you assigned. And these should be prioritized with the system that poses the most risk if it fails at the top of the list and the lowest risk at the bottom. Not having sufficient testing documentation, not following good documentation activities, not having complete or adequate training records. And what happens? You are not able to demonstrate validation testing was appropriate or be able to defend validation work or validation testing and results to FDA. Not having validation documentation that FDA will consider good documentation. It could be invalidated. And not able to demonstrate users and others are qualified to perform their role. Again, data could be invalidated. So remember some things, that requirements for record retention and review don't differ by data format. So if it's structured data, which is a typical database record with uniform fields, or it's unstructured data, which would be something like a Word document, an Excel spreadsheet, or perhaps a PowerPoint or PDF. Any of these documents or any of these groups of data must be able to be retained, must be retained for the record retention required by FDA. Paper-based and electronic data, either one, they follow the same requirements. You're required to do exactly the same thing, meet the same standard for paper and electronic. And many factors influence how FDA approaches regulatory requirements. If there are sudden changes, they tend to be very reactive, and we saw that with COVID. But in the case where changes happen over time, they adapt more slowly and in a steadier manner to the change. Changes caused by one company could result in new requirements for the industry. So for example, when Tylenol was found to have cyanide in it in the late 1970s, from that point forward, all industry manufacturers had to provide childproof caps for their products. So it could be because of product recalls, it could be unintended use of a product, or compliance issues about using a product. So a lot of factors lead FDA to scrutinize companies more or less heavily. Technology, product changes and breakthroughs, new changing diseases and conditions, economy, politics, society, media, historical events, and global pressure. You have to think of FDA as a group of people. They are funded under the US government. They get so much of a budget or less of a budget depending on the year. Also, how the economy is going. So they may or may not have as much money. With politics, it may be an environment where there's more regulation or less regulation depending on who's in charge. And society, how they view the various manufacturers and companies involved in life science industries. Do they look at them as the good guys or the bad guys? Media, how do they portray what's going on? Historical events, have there been issues in the past that are giving some kind of indication that we should be looking for these in the future? And global pressure, where FDA now has to go beyond the US boundary and investigate things that are happening around the world. With technology in particular, cloud technology, hosting services, wireless handheld devices, mobile applications, automated testing, artificial intelligence and blockchain, telemedicine, telemonitoring, biometrics for security. All of these things are newer technologies. What you have to keep in mind is that regardless of the technology, regardless of the approach you take to do your validation work, FDA expects you to do exactly what they instruct you to do, what is required, but they're never going to tell you how to do it. So whether it's a particular technology, don't expect a guidance on it. So they're not going to issue a guidance on cloud. They're not going to issue a specific guidance on any of these technologies, unless it comes to a point like with Part 11. Part 11 was introduced as a guidance because the FDA was trying to mitigate the happening in the late 70s and early 80s. There was a lot of fraud. And the idea of Part 11 was to make sure you could not make a change to something without a record of it. And so it was decided that was a good way to detect and prevent fraud. And so in the 90s, FDA came out finally in 97 with the guidance for electronic records and signatures. But they're not going to provide guidance unless it's really going to drive home the point and people are not following something and need to have a wake-up call. That happened with data integrity. In 2018, they issued a guidance on data integrity. There were no new requirements in that guidance. It simply restated the requirements that have been on the books for decades that people were all of a sudden not following very carefully. And so they felt that the industry needed a wake-up call from management to get behind this and start cleaning up their operations, and for the performers to adhere to the requirements. Data warehouses, analytics and reporting, encryption, cyber defense, web-based applications. All of these things have challenges unique to them, but what is required by FDA is the same, and we'll see that with validation. How you conduct the validation will be different, and how you meet each requirement from FDA will be different. So the FDA inspectors and auditors are not going to be able to keep up with all the changes in technology or how you're using it. For example, you saw where in 2016, finally, FDA had enough training of their auditors to be able to really do a good job inspecting for Part 11 citations. And you see that was after the guidance was issued in 97. So it took them 19 years to really get out there and start applying what they should have known in the first place, or be able to go to industry and make the right judgments when they're doing an audit. And again, FDA only instructs you as to what is required. They will never tell you how to comply with that requirement. They're never going to give you step-by-step instructions. It's up to each company to determine how to comply based on a particular technology they're using. So other factors that contribute to regulatory trends, regulatory maturity, investigator background and expertise, culture of the company, management oversight, prior history or relationship with the office, geographical location of the firm, availability of the required expertise, and public information about safety and efficacy. Now, FDA first came out with the guidance for computer system validation in 1983, 40 years ago. It was called the Blue Book because it was issued on blue paper because there was no internet at the time. And the FDA made it very clear that validation is the process of assuring a system does what it purports to do and has been thoroughly tested to prove it. What does a system purport to do? That's the requirements, what it purports to do. You have to thoroughly test to make sure each requirement is met. It's based on a system development lifecycle methodology, an SDLC, and that's really the way systems are always looked at. You have a system, it has a life. It starts, you create the system, you retire the system. And throughout that process, you must put the system under formal change control. And then as you make changes, there is a requirement to plan them, do the right level of testing, and document that changes were made correctly. The second thing FDA said, besides assuring a system does what it purports to do and is thoroughly tested, you have to maintain the system in a validated state throughout its life. So those are the two things called out in the first guidance that are still required today. And the SDLC supports FDA requirements for validation. It's a way of framing everything. It's integral to it, no matter what methodology you use. It's a framework for selecting through retirement, including a life cycle of phases. So what does FDA require? Overall, you must prove 4 things. The system does what it purports to do and has been thoroughly tested to prove it. A second thing was added after the first guidance was issued, saying that the system must be suitable for its intended use and thoroughly tested to prove it. And intended use is what the subject matter expert, who is the user of the system and the owner of the data, they must explain how they intend to use the system in different scenarios for testing. And also a risk-based approach must be taken. So in the early 2000s, they realized at FDA that they couldn't possibly investigate every system at every company. They were increasing exponentially. So they put the onus on industry in the early 2000s to take a risk-based approach. You not only have to do the risk assessment for your overall system at a high level and get 1 risk rating and use that in your GXP system inventory, but then as you're going through validation, every single requirement that you define must be assessed for potential risk if the requirement's not met. And then the level of testing must match whatever the level of risk is. More risk, more testing. Less risk, less testing. And again, you have to make sure you maintain the system in a validated state under formal change control. How you do any of these things is completely up to every company to determine and document. And as long as you can justify your approach, you're in good shape for an audit. You have to be able to explain that you took these 4 steps, that this is what you're doing to show these things are met. Now, once your system's in maintenance mode in the life cycle where it's in production, you've planned, analyzed, designed, coded, tested, you've gotten your system into production. Now it's under formal change control. Any code must be frozen. Any configuration settings for functionality must also be frozen. And in this case, a formal request must be issued. So you should have an IT change control SOP that allows someone to request a specific change, indicate the impact of the change on the validated state of the system, and based on that potential impact, recommend appropriate testing. Test the change and do regression testing to make sure the change didn't alter anything else. So once you select a system, you should be using a strategic approach that you follow for all of your systems for validation. An overall company approach. FDA is looking for consistency, that you're applying the same methodology, the same approach to all your systems. Now, the approach may be a little bit different, but the way you come up with the rationale for doing your testing, the risk assessment, all of those things should be built into that approach. What rationale are you going to use to demonstrate the system is fully tested and validated to meet compliance? What SDLC phases will you include? And then who's involved? What are you going to do for testing? How is that going to be done? How will documentation and approvals be completed? All of these things are really up to individual companies to determine how they want to do things. And where you have a system that you're going to implement, it's going to be overlaid on a particular process, a business process. You want to look at that business process, and before you spend a lot of money automating it through technology, look at the process and see if it's optimized. And if it isn't, look at a way to re-engineer that and make it more optimal. Most companies don't opt for this step. They skip over it. They end up taking a system at face value, and whatever the system does, that's how their process has to work. They never look at ways to improve the process, or at least most of them don't. And then determine if the system's going to be integrated with a legacy system that is or isn't validated. If it isn't, it must be validated as well. Organizational change management. It's not enough just to get the training, but people have to embrace the new changes and be willing to use the new way of working. Is it going to work in your environment? And policies and procedures. These should be looked at to make sure they are all up to date. They reflect what work you're doing. And training must be part of the project. Also, how are you going to transition everything into production, maintain it in a validated state over its life? So the first step is a validation plan of some type of plan. You can call it anything you want. Determine who's going to be using the system, for what purpose. How is the system implementation and validation activities going to be managed? Are there prerequisites? Is a vendor involved? You have to answer all these questions. So validation planning is your approach to how you're going to validate a particular system. And then it should be based on a standard approach that you define in some sort of validation SOP. You would then have that SOP enable you to make choices depending on, for example, technology you're using, or platform, or methodology of development. But the plan should be basically telling you, for this particular system, this technology, this way of doing things, this is how we're going to do the testing. Your user requirement specification is at a very high level in business terminology. It's the user, the subject matter expert, explaining what they intend to do with the system. What is their intended use? It should be high level, and then that should be broken down into individual functional requirement specifications or elements in the FRS. So one URS will have one or more FRS elements, and that defines what the system purports to do. Now, there's also a system design spec for coded software and a configuration management spec if there's configurable functionality in your software. Those are solutions. Those tell you how the requirements are met. Back in 1983, most code was homegrown. Most of it was developed by an IT group on site. And so these documents were usually available. But with the advent of using a lot of vendor packages, cloud providers, software as a service, you don't always get these documents. And it's not important, because really, once you install the application software package and you show through validation testing that it meets all the requirements and the intended use, and this is done on a risk-based approach, that automatically confirms the underlying design and configuration are appropriate. If they weren't appropriate, the system application wouldn't work right. You then implement the system and look at the GAM5 category. We'll talk about that in a minute. Then you do your installation, operational, and performance qualification, IQ, OQ, and PQ. The IQ of something verifies that that something was designed properly. If you install it, give it the right instruction, get the right responses on screen during installation, then your design is verified as a result of that. With operational qualification, you're testing every single requirement, making sure it is met. With performance qualification, you're verifying suitability of the system to do what the user needs, with scenarios defined by your subject matter experts. Then you'll have test summary reports. You could have one for each of these three phases. You could have one that combines all three, as long as you can discern the difference. And then a validation summary report, overall saying you followed everything to plan and it all worked out fine, or there were deviations and this is how you handled them, and as a result, you come to a conclusion about the validated state of your system. Now, system acceptance report, this is not something required by FDA, but back in the 80s, when homegrown code was king, you had the IT group working with the subject matter experts. And the subject matter experts tended to keep going back to IT and changing their mind on requirements, adding requirements, asking to have some removed. And IT put their foot down and said, we're not going to do anything until first the users define their requirements completely and approve them, and not change them after that. And then when the system goes in place, we're going to get them to sign a form that what was delivered was what they asked for. Now, this was really just to help the IT people, so it was done as a best practice, but it's not something required today. You don't have to have all your functional requirements approved before someone starts doing development work on them or design work. You don't have to have system acceptance report at all. But these were good for keeping the users under control and not making the project go completely off scope because they decided to change something and kept doing that throughout the process. The system notification release. This is from the system steward, whoever is responsible for notifying stakeholders that the system is available in production. And note that PQ is also called user acceptance testing. These terms are one and the same, UAT and PQ. So you want to have a validation approach that addresses the type and level of testing required based on some factors that you must consider. First, the size of the system, the complexity of the system, the business criticality. These are all subjective and needed to gauge the amount of resources and time that you'll need for how robust the testing must be based on the risk assessment you do for each of the requirements. The GAMP5 system category and a system risk assessment must also be factored in, and these 5 things should be documented in your plan. Now, one thing I can tell you, size, complexity, and business criticality. These are things that you have to decide on. Size can mean it's a big system with a lot of lines of code. It could be that it's used with algorithms that are very complex and very time consuming to run. System complexity, it could be used by multiple functional units. It could be used by multiple sites. System business criticality, is it something you must rely on, for example, for lot recall? As size increases, complexity increases, and business criticality increases. Each of these things contributes to having to do more work, usually, if they are big enough. Now, ISPE, the International Society for Pharmaceutical Engineering, they have developed GAMP5, Good Automated Manufacturing Practice. It's a set of industry best practices. GAMP5 second edition was issued last July 2022. And basically, these are best practices focused on patient safety, product quality, data integrity, effective governance of data. It's a scalable approach and helps you improve your efficiency and effectiveness of doing validation. But it's not required. FDA doesn't require you to follow anything from ISPE, to follow GAMP5, or to do anything that anyone gives you stepwise to execute validation. You are free to execute it the way you think it should be done. So GAMP5 can improve your existing methodology. It can show it's fit for intended use. It's based on industry best practice, but it's not prescriptive. It's not step by step. You must think about what they offer you as guidance and then apply that with your own expertise and good judgment. Now, categories of software. There are 4 categories now in GAMP5. In GAMP4, there were 5 categories. Category 2 was removed when they moved to GAMP5 because most of the things in Category 2, which was mainly firmware, PLCs, things that either don't have any real intelligence behind them and belong in Category 1, or if they're a little more sophisticated, they might be in a Category 3, 4, or 5. The Category 1 is your basic foundational infrastructure software, your operating system, database software, tools, and utilities. You want to do a vendor audit if that's appropriate, if it's not something widely used in industry. And then you want to do an IQ, installation qualification, and prove that the item, the particular software, was installed properly. Once you install it properly, you know the underlying design of these items is correct. With Category 3, here we have products that are not configurable in terms of functionality. These are out-of-the-box solutions. Here, you can't customize or configure any functionality, but you do a vendor audit, you do an installation qualification, and you do an operational qualification. PQ is not necessarily required for this level because you're not dealing with any configurable functionality or custom code. In Category 4, you have configured functionality in your product. You do a vendor audit, IQ, OQ, and PQ. And in Category 5, you have custom applications, new code. Again, you do a vendor audit, IQ, OQ, and PQ. So notice when you go from Category 1, where you have items that are heavily used throughout the world. Say you look at Windows Microsoft Windows operating system. That's used so heavily in the world that if you install correctly, you know it's going to work correctly. You know the design is correct. You don't have to go beyond that. But when you go through 3, 4, and 5, especially with category 5, you may have a solution unique to your organization. It's not heavily road tested through the industry. It's something that you have to heavily test based on the potential risk of failure. Now, the risk-based approach was brought to light by FDA in the early 2000s. Not having enough staff to inspect every system, they expect you to prioritize systems based on potential risk. You have to use a standard risk approach. This is an industry best practice. There are many examples of it on the internet. Basically, an IT risk assessment and mitigation type of an SOP. The risk assessment is done in a way that shows that for each requirement, for example, you are looking at the potential risk of that requirement failing. What would that risk look like? If it's high, you want to do more testing. If it's low, you do less testing. You document the results in a matrix form, and you use things like the probability or likelihood of something happening, the consequences, the severity of failure, the detectability, would you know it happened, and whatever procedural and technical controls you have in place to mitigate risk, and weigh those 4 factors together. In the validation plan, you're going to have that high-level risk assessment for the overall system. So with the high-level system risk assessment, ask the question, if the system were to fail, what impact would that have on process, product, patient, or consumer? And we know that a system can fail in many different and unrelated ways. Keep it simple. I use 3 particular scenarios. One is where there's a power outage, or for some reason the system's not available. The second one is where you have a software glitch that's really very low level, more cosmetic. The third is a software glitch that's more serious, where you have something like, say, your system is recording results incorrectly, or saying something's out of spec when it isn't, or in spec when it isn't when it's out of spec. And you could make a bad decision about releasing product. So think about at the system level, what would happen? Think about the functions performed, the data used, what's affected by it, how could it fail? And then say, for example, the case of a power outage, or your system is down. How could it fail? The probability would depend on your system and the utilities in your area. The severity would be 0, because with the system not working, you can't produce bad data or have any risk to the consumer. And then how likely would you detect it? With failure like that, you would detect it immediately. So nothing bad would happen. Your risk would be really 0 at that point, or very low. You want to identify those same risk scenarios for your risk assessment of your requirements. So for each requirement, ask the same question. If the requirement failed, if it was not met, what would happen? What would be the probability of that requirement not being met, the severity of impact if the requirement wasn't met, the detectability if it happened, or what mitigation do you have in place in terms of technical and/or procedural controls to mitigate that risk? And from that, determine the priority for each requirement. So here I show high, medium, low. I use a qualified scale, high, medium, low, because it's easier to get consensus in a group. If you start using a quantified scale like 1 through 10, even 1 through 5, it becomes difficult for people to distinguish the difference between, in a scale of 1 to 10, what's a 7 or an 8, or what's a 3 or a 4. People argue that forever, and you don't want to get caught up in those discussions. It's easier to keep it high, medium, low, and keep it simple. The validation plan uses this and takes the results to drive the scope, the extent, the rigor of the activities. With this risk rating matrix, you can see likelihood on the x-axis, consequences on the y-axis. And we see that as likelihood increases, we have to define what is meant by low, medium, and high likelihood. You have to define these either directly in the table, or they have to have a table associated with it to reference that would give you what these values are, the criteria for selecting each value. The same for consequences. What is high, medium, and low? What do they look like? And then once you have, say you have a requirement and there are 3 different ways it could fail. And one is highly likely and high injury, serious. One is not very likely, but could still cause some serious injury. And then maybe the other one is not likely and wouldn't cause any injury. So you figure out which cell the 2 meet at. So depending on low, medium, high for likelihood, low, medium, high for consequences, where does that fall in the matrix for each scenario? So you would have 3 different boxes highlighted, or you could have 2 risks that are in the same box, but the 3 of them should be shown on this to show how you did it. When you have that system inventory, GXP system inventory, a simple 2-column matrix, 1 column with your system or application name, the 2nd column with the risk rating, prioritized with the highest potential risk system at the top of the list. And this is going to assure that risk is minimized. You also have to have those requirements assigned a risk rating directly in your requirements specification, your FRS, or whatever you call your document for listing out all your requirements. So who has to care about CSV? With IT and automated systems, anyone who is involved in developing, testing, or supporting the system in maintenance mode. Those people have to be not only technically trained, but they have to understand how to maintain the system in a validated state. Users, functional experts, have to know how to use the system functionality, how to do validation work that they're required to do, such as performing testing. Your quality auditors, they have to have oversight to everything. So they not only have to know the operational area, the functional requirements of your system, how it works, but also they have to understand how you do validation to be able to do an assessment of it and know whether it meets requirements or not. Anyone involved in validation should have validation training by your organization saying, this is how we do validation here. These are the things you need to worry about. And with ISPE, GAMP5, they have the V model. The V model was done years ago, decades ago, and it's basically a flow of how your validation would work. You would start with your plan. You would look at what is required. That's your user and functional requirements. How the system is solutioned through a design or configuration specification or a combination of the 2. And then once you build your system, you go up the right-hand side and you prove that everything's working. Installation verifies the design is correct. Operational qualification, that confirms that the requirements are met. And performance qualification, that shows that the user, how they specify they intend to use the system, is met. And then finally, the validation report. And that will be based on what you planned. Did you do it, or were there deviations, and how do you account for them? Now, that's a very document-centric waterfall methodology. That was what was basically used for most of the last 40 years. Companies still use that approach. It's very document-driven. And so it hinders your ability to really do software development testing and released incrementally. So for example, if you have a vendor that's a software as a service vendor, generally for an application package like Salesforce or SAP or any of them, they will give you so many releases per year. Each release will have an incremental change of new features and functions or modified features and functions. And so that can be done very in a waterfall approach. The company developing and testing and releasing the software is not going to work that quickly. If they're doing a waterfall approach, it's going to take them some time and a lot of documentation involved to get that release of a new version to a customer. If they're following an agile approach, they're going to be able to deliver incremental changes much more quickly, more frequently. But companies are very reluctant to pivot, and they get very confused because document-centric just means you're following a waterfall approach, phased approach, and you're delivering certain documents at each phase. Where you have the agile approach, so here, your system may not be developed, but you are given as a user a set of functional requirements that work and be able to test and show that they're working properly, and then build on that throughout the development and completion of the system. So companies are reluctant to pivot because they don't understand how Agile fits in. They try to take the document centric waterfall approach and kind of shove that methodology into Agile, which doesn't work. Those deliverables don't fit into the Agile framework. But companies are still reluctant. Up until about 5 or 7 years ago, many companies wouldn't even approach a vendor if it was a cloud service or a software as a service vendor. They wanted everything done on site. They wanted to know who the vendor was, who was doing things, what methodology they were using, and they wanted to implement the system and update it accordingly. But FDA is promoting a shift now from the traditional CSV, the document-centric approach, to a computer software assurance approach, CSA, and they issued a draft guidance in September of 2022. So what FDA realized is industry has a compliance mindset. As an industry, we're so worried about audits that we focus and treat everything the way we want to for the sake of the auditor. We're treating every requirement equally. In that sense, you're over-testing some requirements. You may even be under-testing some. But you're creating significant overhead and potential blind spots because you're focused on the documentation, the deliverables. You're not focused on why you're doing what you're doing. You must have a risk-based approach, testing every requirement appropriately based on potential risk if it isn't met. With the modernization of life science industries, there's an increase in new technology, cloud, software as a service. These have been around for decades, but they're new to the life science industry, at least within the last 1 or 2 decades. Cloud and software as a service, those companies manage the infrastructure more efficiently. So for example, a cloud service provider who provides your server and your infrastructure in a cloud, they're going to do all the maintenance on that. And that's going to take away the requirement that your company have an IT group dedicated to keeping that system going, to keeping the lights on. The cloud service provider keeps the lights on, but you're going to have to qualify them. And what I do is a combination, I call it vendor qualification. It's sort of an IQ and a vendor audit for your cloud service provider or a SaaS provider. And what you do is you create a protocol that says, I'm going to go to the vendor's website. I'm going to look at all their policies, procedures, practices, and certifications, gather all those links and information. And then in my report, I'm going to indicate whether or not they are qualified to do this job. And it's something that FDA has not come out and said that's the way to do it, because they're not going to tell you how to do it. But if you can use cloud services or software as a service, you have to be able to qualify them some way. And this seems to me to be the most obvious way to do that. How the CSA approach addresses critical thinking. This is important. CSA is based on critical thinking and risk assessment. And so testing will differ depending on what risk you come up with. And also, as you're doing critical thinking, you may find a better way to do something. Automated testing is an example. Automated testing is where a test script is written that in an automated fashion will run a series of tests on a system and make sure it's working properly. And the documentation for that differs. So for example, most automated test tools document within the tool itself. So it depends, and you have to know what tools are used. When you go to contract with a software as a service vendor, or even if they're installing on-premise a solution, an application software package. You want to make sure that you understand what level of testing the vendor does. Now, the vendor can actually give you the requirements for the system, but you can't just take them at face value and call them your own. You have to vet them, go through each requirement, make sure it's appropriate, make sure the risk rating is defined. And then if they give you test scripts, whether these are to be executed manually or automated test scripts, they must be able to tell you how that's done, and then you can decide whether there is one or more test script in the manual or automated test script they give you. Decide whether there's one or more test scripts per requirement, and that it's robust enough based on the risk assessment of the requirement. So a lot of it can be delivered by the vendor, but you can't take the requirements or test scripts at face value. You must make them your own. You must vet the requirements and then vet the test scripts against the requirements you come up with. So CSA focuses on critical thinking first, then quality testing, and the documentation is really the end game of proving you did what you said you'd do. With CSV, everything's focused on documentation and deliverables. Deliverables drive the process, and very rarely do people use critical thinking when they're doing this. There are many times in watching people do CSV where they've said, I don't understand why I'm doing this part of it because it doesn't seem to add value. And in some cases, they were right, but they still did it because that's the way they did things. They did it by rote. They did this for every system. They didn't think through critically whether or not that made sense and adjust accordingly. How do you think critically? You ask questions, question assumptions. You try to reverse or shake things up. Look at it from a different perspective. Evaluate existing evidence. Anything the vendor can offer, you can leverage that. But always think for yourself and understand you don't do this 100% of the time. So based on that, in some cases, a test might be simple if the requirement doesn't have a high potential risk if it fails to be met. But if a requirement does have a high potential risk if it fails to be met, you do more rigorous testing. You might include, in addition to positive test scenarios, which show that the system does what it purports to do, you may do negative testing scenarios, which show that the system doesn't do what it doesn't purport to do. You might do boundary or stress testing. You might have multiple rounds of testing. Whatever it takes, you would do it based on whatever rating came up for risk. And when you test a higher level process, you may automatically qualify the underlying systems and save a lot of time and effort. So for example, you would never do an OQ on a server, operating system, application database setup. You don't do anything but an IQ on those things. And FDA is trying to modernize their own systems, and they're trying to encourage industry to do the same with a risk-based and continuous validation approach, which can be done through automated testing and then critical thinking. They'll get better results and products will get to market faster. That's the goal of FDA, getting good quality, safe products in the hands of users or consumers. Now, an agile methodology, a lot of companies talk about it, but in most cases, they're not sure what it means or how you do it, and they're reluctant to adopt it. They think that there's got to be too much overhead and cost associated with this if we go that route. And that's because they're trying to plug in the waterfall deliverables into an agile methodology, and that's not the way to do it. So when we looked at that V model for using the waterfall approach, we can adopt that to an agile approach. Same documentation can be used and adapted, but it's going to be different. It's going to have different timing for completion, review, and approval, and the documents are going to vary. Now, the ISPE has a special interest group, a SIG, that was specifically established in order to provide industry with best practices and guidance on how to apply Agile development to GXP software. Critical thinking-based, risk-based approach, removing aspects that don't add value. So you can go to the ispe.org website, look for the special interest group, find out about their presentations, their white papers that they issue. They do have a lot of information about best practices, and that's going to continue to evolve. So we saw the GAN5D model for the phased waterfall approach. We can adapt it for Agile. Here, you're mainly going to start with your validation plan, just as in a waterfall approach, but then you're going to create a subset of your functional requirements that are already very well groomed, very well refined, as granular as you can get them. And then you would take that subset of requirements into what you would call sprint. The first sprint would include one subset of requirements. During the sprint, and the sprint is defined as usually 2 or 3 weeks in duration, but you can define it as any length of time you want. During that 2 or 3 weeks, during that sprint, you'll take that subset of requirements, you'll have the design, the configuration, the coding, the development, whatever is needed, that will be done on that subset. And then that subset of requirements, that functionality will be installed, operationally qualified, and then you now have a piece of functioning code. At the end of each sprint, you're going to have a minimum viable product, a set of functionality that works, a subset of the overall system. At the end of the first sprint, if you still have requirements to use, you go back. You say it's not the final sprint. You go back to the user requirements, pick up a second subset of functional requirements, and now do the same process for those. And you would repeat that until you got to the nth sprint, where at some point you run out of requirements. Now, is it the final sprint? Yes. Now you jump off and do performance qualification. So this is very handy for people that are developing code. And if you are doing things in the way of a software as a service, for example, then they should be giving you incremental changes a little bit more frequently than if they were not following this Agile approach. So if they're following Agile, they're going to give you incremental changes to your code several times a year, for example. And each time you would be doing a same look to make sure what they're giving you, the increment they give you, that it's working properly. And you would make sure that the final sprint was determined and you were able to jump off and finish validation. With the case where they're incrementing, so this would represent one iteration of an update from a vendor. The vendor gives you a new release. You go through the process of taking what they gave you in the new release. They've already done the design, the development, installed it, operationally tested it. Now it's up to you to do the performance qualification on it. So going back to requirements, the URS is very high-level business terminology, and it's important that even if you don't have a URS specification document, you have to have something like meeting minutes or notes from interviews, because you have to demonstrate that you did ask the questions and the users, the subject matter experts, were the ones who came up with what exactly they intend to do with the system. So it should be from their mouth. And so whatever way you want to document that is fine. Based on the URS, you're going to break that down into very detailed, granular functional requirements. Every function at a detailed level. And users should define and approve these. But again, they don't have to approve them all before you start work, before your vendor starts work. Only include requirements for functionality that you're going to use. If you get a package and part of it you're not going to ever use, don't include that function or feature in your validation, because you're not going to use it. And then in your validation plan, you would specify that you ignored those particular functions or features because you're not going to use them. That's why you didn't include them in validation. Requirements have to be unique, uniquely identified, testable, feasible, supporting your process. Now, basically, the important thing here is when someone does an action on a system, they expect a response to be a certain way. That's your requirement. I do this, I expect this response. That's a requirement. Got to be clearly understood between whoever is developing the software, testing it, and who is using the software in the end, because it's the basis of a user commitment. At a very high level, you have the business requirements or strategy from the company that's driving all of this. So in this particular example, they want to automate manufacturing equipment. At a high level, in the middle section, you see user requirements. And these are at a high level, the functional requirements the system needs to perform stated by the user. I want to press tablets. When you drill down to the detailed FRS elements, then you have to say, well, what does it mean to press tablets? For press tablets, you might have several different FRS elements that tie back to it. So maybe there's a capacity or speed or diameter or many other factors involved. Whatever you need should be stated there individually. But don't forget at the very bottom, you have system or non-functional requirements. These go beyond the functionality. They're the things that must be in place for the system to work properly, to function. They are enablers of functionality. In this case, the press has to be in a temperature range of 50 to 100 degrees all the time in order to operate properly. That's a system requirement. Now, requirements can come from many, many sources, and this is a list that can be used just for discussion purposes. So you can at least think that you're not going to leave anything out if you cover all of these. There may be some beyond this. And when we talk about the non-functional system requirements, an example of that is providing the user with access to an application. So just like we saw with the temperature range had to be in place for a system to operate, now here users have to be able to access the application in order to be able to conduct their functions, work their functions. So the user access is an enabler, a system function, system requirement. And other examples, performance, scalability, and so forth through these lists. So for example, you might have a system that has to have a capacity of so many gigs for storage, one that has to be available 95% of the time, one that has to be able to give you a certain response time or be able to handle a certain number of concurrent users at the same time. And basically you would include these requirements and then you test. You put a bunch of people on the system, make sure that as they're all concurrently doing things, that nobody is seeing a degradation of performance. And that would be a verification. With capacity, you could go and verify the storage capacities there. And you do the same for any of these particular requirements. The requirements to include and never miss, because these have been the subject of recent FDA findings: security permissions, error messaging and logging, system shutdown and overload handling, and you would test each of these during validation. They're high-profile requirements the FDA would expect to find, and these are non-functional or system requirements. In the detailed system design spec, again, this is the solution to what the system purports to do. If it's coded software, it's a system design spec. If it's configurable functionality, it's a configuration management spec. You might have both if there's configurable functionality and custom code in a system. But in each case, these things should tell you how the system is solutioned, how the requirements are met. But again, you may not have access to these. If the vendor has them, you would want to make sure you state in your validation plan, we asked the vendor, they wouldn't provide these documents. And so by virtue of the fact that once we put the application software in place and we test that through OQ and maybe PQ, then we are confirming that the underlying design or configuration settings on the system are correct. Testing IQ, OQ, and PQ. IQ for any component, OQ for the application software you're working on, and PQ for the application software if there's a specific way to execute it that might be different than how other clients of the vendor's products would do it. You want a detailed plan for all of this. Again, if more robust testing is needed, positive and negative scenarios, boundary and stress testing. Anytime you come across a defect, a deficiency, a deviation when you're testing, you have to investigate for root cause, you have to remediate, resolve it, and retest it. Segregation of duties has to be followed. No one should be able to review or approve their own work. And a summary report either at the end of each phase, IQ, OQ, PQ, or combining the phases in one summary report. But you have to be able to discern which phase you're talking about at any point in time. Now you can purchase an IQ, OQ test package from many vendors. They sell these. They'll also sell you the service to actually execute IQ and OQ. And this is perfectly acceptable. However, you must make sure you audit the vendor or the contractor, you vet them, make sure that they are capable of doing this work properly. And then you still have to have oversight to everything they do. You must review and approve all of their work. Review and approve their plans before they execute those protocols, and then review and approve the work that they collect. So this can be a big time savings, but it comes at a cost. However, when you get to PQ, you can have external resources prepare your PQ protocol and summary report. They can prepare the test scenarios and scripts, but only if they get direct input from your subject matter experts. And that has to be documented. Once they get that input and write the PQ protocol, they can't execute it. Only the subject matter expert can execute that protocol, but the external resource can write the summary report. And again, if they write the protocol and the summary report, you must be able to do a vendor audit, and you must know the contractor is vetted, is following the practices you need them to do. And then you would have oversight by reviewing the protocol before it is finalized, and then reviewing the final summary report. But absolutely, your subject matter experts, your employees, must execute PQ. No one else can do this. Now, you want to pick a vendor that's a mature vendor with a robust quality management system, a good way of developing software. You want to make sure that they're not going to change something, put it in production, and break something else. So you want to vet them. When you have test results, deviations must be handled. If you have a script or tester error, you can correct them immediately. So the script was written incorrectly, or the tester error, the tester executed it incorrectly or recorded the result incorrectly. In both cases, you can correct these immediately and continue testing. With a system error, this is a glitch in the software. You've got to stop testing. Report this as a deviation or a discrepancy or a deficiency, whatever you want to call it. And then that's got to be investigated for root cause, remediated, and retesting must be done. Now, if that has to go back to the vendor to fix, and they're going to recompile the code and issue it, you may have to start over with installation qualification and operational qualification again, start from the beginning. You also note that your protocols are documents that can be reused. You can amend them, you can make copies and use them for different projects, but they're reusable. And when you're done, you have a requirements traceability matrix. Now, back in 1983, we had design elements, and so they were included here. But these are no longer available in most cases from vendors. So what's really key is to focus on every requirement must have one or more test scripts associated with it. Your requirements traceability matrix is simply one column with each requirement listed, and in the second column, every test script associated with each requirement is listed next to it. When system testing is complete, when training is complete, you can opt to do a system acceptance form, but that's not required by FDA. And then you would notify people that it's in production. Once the system's in production, you must have all of the documentation available and ready to use on day one to maintain it in a validated state. And this is where your technical system steward or your vendor must be able to do these things. Now, with electronic records and signatures, this is a guidance that came out in '97. It's going to tell you, again, what's required, not how to meet the requirement. A lot of companies weren't sure how to do this. And basically definitions, electronic record, combination of text, graphics, and so forth, represented in digital format, created or handled on a computer. Electronic signature, compilation of symbols executed that are the legally binding equivalent of your handwritten signature. The handwritten signature also includes when you sign something, you are signing with a given meaning of your signature. So when you sign electronically, the intent of the signing must be clear. Now, Part 11 says you have to define the criteria under which you consider your electronic records and signatures accurate, secure, authentic, trustworthy, reliable, and confidential if that's personally identifiable information is included. And this is a sort of a cheat sheet. This is the way you do this when you're validating your system. Call a subset of your requirements as 21 CFR Part 11 requirements. And in these, the requirements listed here, accurate, secure, and so forth, those are actual requirements in your requirements document. The acceptance criteria is what you use when you test against those requirements to make sure they're met. How do you test that data is correct? Over in the third column, these are all the audit trails, the version control, anything, any technical and or procedural control you have in place to assure that the requirement is met, meets the acceptance criteria. Those controls should be stated here. And then when you test your requirements, you test each control. In some cases, you may verify a control. For example, verify you've got antivirus software. So Part 11 lets you replace any paper records, handwritten signatures with electronic records and electronic signatures. What is required for paper is the same that's required for electronic, only how you meet the requirement is what's different. Record retention and review is also the same, whether it's electronic or paper. And these are subject, again, to the same requirements. Think first about what you would have to do on a paper record or what you have to prove about a handwritten signature and apply that what to the electronic records and signatures. The how is going to be different, but what is required? Authenticity, intent, being clear, those are what are required. How you do it is going to be different. And data integrity, again, violations have been exponentially increasing, and there have been no new requirements. We see from 2010 to 12, we saw 5 warning letters with data integrity violations. In 2013 to 15, there were 24, almost a 5-fold increase. And what does data integrity mean? Your data has to be attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original or true copy, and accurate, plus complete, consistent, enduring, and available. And this is a chart similar to the one for 21 CFR Part 11, showing every requirement, the ones that are listed in Alcoa Plus. Again, you have certain controls in your last column, technical and procedural, to make sure you can meet the requirement, and what you have to meet, the acceptance criteria, is in the middle column. So you could have a subset of data integrity requirements and then use this chart as a roadmap to do that. Now, data integrity came out in 2018 from FDA, but again, they didn't give you any new requirements. It's just restating what was already on the books, because people were showing a lack of thoroughness. They were not doing things right the first time. So backup data exact and complete, secure from alteration and loss, storing to prevent deterioration or loss, documenting things at the time they happened, contemporaneous, records as original or true copies. A true copy is one where you look at the original, you compare the copy to the original, and the copy, if you verify it's exact, you can then initial and date the copy and document that it's a true copy. Complete information. You can't throw data away. This is what FDA has been finding in both trash bins, in operational areas, and recycle bins on computers. They're finding people are throwing data away. Why are they doing that? Because pressure from management is saying you have to finish this work in a certain amount of time with fewer resources. They're driving and putting pressure on performers. The performers find that, well, if I just throw this data away, I won't have to go through all the work of investigating the root cause and documenting all of this and explaining why it's not part of my result set. But to avoid doing that, they just throw it away and pretend it never happened and hope that no one finds it. That's fraud, and it will be found. So this is something FDA is very strong and focused on looking at. So make sure the software is suitable, the hardware is suitable, that incidents related to the system are reported, investigated, remediated, retested during the life of the system. Changes are done under formal change control. Every change is recorded, documented, and the system can be shown to be maintained in a validated state. FDA expects you to put a lot of effort into this based on potential risk to product quality and patient safety. Data governance is important, data integrity policies, staff training, and being able to show adequacy of each vendor product, each application software package. You're applying the same standard across the board. Here's an example of a data integrity violation. Someone threw the raw data in the trash, and FDA found it because they didn't want to have to do the work, the legwork to investigate what happened and document it. In this case, failed to maintain product testing data, failed to ensure data attributable to a specific person. People were sharing user IDs and passwords. Falsification, inaccuracy of data, that could be intentional or non-intentional. Failure to complete things when they happen. Not having raw data available for FDA review in human readable format on screen or on paper, something you can decipher. Overwriting a file to obscure the original. Date and time stamps are also important because if you have a server in the cloud or an on-premise server, usually the date and time on the server is synced up with Meridian or Standard Time. But if you have a legacy system in a lab or manufacturing area and you have software loaded onto a local device running that particular piece of equipment or instrument, then the application software is going to take the date or time from the local device. And you must make sure that the date and time for that local device is locked down and no one can change it. Here, there weren't controls about changing data, audit trails turned off, people substituting, deleting, overwriting data, sharing user IDs and passwords, people creating unauthorized folders outside of the oversight of a quality organization, unauthorized access, making changes to data when they're not authorized to do so. Only including most favorable result, throwing data away, testing into compliance until you get the result you want, and not doing any justification. Not recording things contemporaneously, destroying original data, using sticky notes or rough, loose notes to transcribe things, to record things and then transcribe them into the system. That's considered fraud. Backdating, forward dating. So you have to have a solid validation program, policies and procedures to support it. This is just a guidance policy topic checklist. The topics should be covered, whether or not you include them in one policy or multiple, it doesn't matter. And the same is for procedures. You can see this topic checklist, and these, there should be something instructing a user in how to do it. Most of these are then getting into maintenance of the system. So best practice, when you audit the vendor, leverage the vendor's work products as much as you can. Audit them every 2 years, conduct a site visit, look at their vendor findings of deficiencies. Make sure you're working with a mature vendor. Key areas, look at their viability as a company, responsibility and accountability, system performance, data integrity. You have to be able to demonstrate to FDA that the vendor who developed your application is going to be able to support that application, be able to have unit integration testing done, change control, system patches and upgrades done appropriately. You have to show them that. If it's a software as a service or cloud provider, you want to make sure your contract says that if they're going to go out of business in 30 days, you can get in and retrieve your data and not lose it in the cloud. And then IQ, again, is going to be a different way of approaching it. Go to the vendor's website and do a research effort. Record all the findings. Make sure any vendor of cloud or SaaS services is SOC 2 certified. They should have a certificate for that for cybersecurity. And then make sure you have OQ and PQ. That's going to be the same whether you're cloud or on-premise. The maintenance will be based on whether it's cloud or SaaS. It'll be the vendor doing the maintenance, or it could be you're doing it. Have a good contract and service level agreement with the vendor to be able to assure that's happening. So have a good policy and procedure in place. Request an audit plan before the FDA comes in. Look for a scope memo. Then communicate to your people all the plans and strategies. The idea here is to avoid any sense of secrecy. So have one trusted point of contact who fields the questions and provides responses. Be clear that no one else should speak with the FDA about anything related to the company. Use a meeting room near the front door. Make sure they stay there, the FDA, unless escorted. Maintain the upper hand. Be friendly, accommodating, and professional, but careful control should be exhibited. Know your rights and obligations. You have 20 minutes to come up with data when they ask you for something. Set up a war room next to that meeting room. Stock it with all the paper that you might need in an organized manner. Make individuals responsible for key areas of the information. Sit there during the whole audit. Make sure they have a laptop so they can access the electronic data they need to reach to follow up and answer questions. And use technology. You could have an assistant with the person who's the point of contact in the meeting room, an assistant who is using a laptop to display in real time messages to the war room, telling them what FDA is asking for, what they're looking for, what area to start thinking about. Give them a heads up. And make sure you get good feedback at the end of each day. Listen carefully. Ask them for any concerns they might have. Keep a list of all the requests, what you've given them. Only offer positive information. Don't give them any dirty laundry or any reason to ask further questions. If you don't agree with something, you can raise a challenge to that, but you have to decide whether it's worth it. Careful with your words and your body language. Always show openness. Careful of your own temperature throughout the day. Don't get overheated. And have a training program for the people who are involved in your audit. Do a mock audit. Look at industry best practices. Emphasize both the importance of the content of what's conveyed and the manner in which you deliver it to the FDA during an inspection. Use role playing. Use worst case scenarios. What's the worst thing that the FDA could ask us for? And how would you resolve that? Challenge them to contribute ideas. Common problems. Improper sequencing of validation steps in your documentation. These are things that FDA could come back with. Not adequately using electronic records and signatures and controlling security. Not adequately doing your vendor audits. Retaining all legacy systems, even though you put a new system in, now you have two sets of books available to a user, and if they use both, it's confusion and decisions will be invalidated. And not doing the additional testing or revalidation during change control. Don't get a self-inflicted wound. Respond to your 483s effectively, responsively, and on time. The same for a warning letter or a consent decree. Don't wait for FDA to escalate your case. So that concludes the presentation, and now we can go to any questions.
Thank you, Carolyn. Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to remind you that if you wish to ask any question, kindly type them in a question box now. And Carolyn, I think we already have some questions, so I'll just read out for you.
Okay.
The
Sure.
first one is, when an FDA inspector arrives at a location to be audited, is there any way for the site to prevent or limit FDA ability to do this work?
No, there is no way. And when I mentioned the FDA Asia Act in 2012, that said very firmly and concretely, if FDA knocks on the door, you must let them in. If you don't, or if you try to limit them in any way, they can deem every product at your site as adulterated, every single product. So you don't want to have that happen. So make sure you let them in and let them inspect what they need to.
Thank you. The second one is, when an FDA inspector asks question about the system, that are technical in nature, how should the subject matter expert respond?
The subject matter expert should be able to work with somebody on the technical side to understand what the question is and how to respond to it. And they can have that conversation, but that there should be technical people available during the inspection so that if a question does come up, that's a technical question, that somebody's there to be able to respond. If it's a question that has to go back to a vendor on how they did something, then you would have to table that and then try to get an answer by the next day. You want to be able to answer things as much as possible in any given day of inspection. You want to close it out cleanly. So if you don't answer something during the day and have to carry it over to the next day, make sure you address that. Don't just forget about it.
Thank you. We have another one. During an inspection, would a subject matter expert or the single point of contact for that audit be able to ask FDA what specially they are looking for?
That's something you've got to be careful about. So if they're asking you a series of questions and you in your mind are gathering that they're headed in some direction, don't try to jump the gun and tell them, oh, I know you're looking for this, because they may not be. They may be thinking of something different. So don't put words in their mouth. If they're thinking about something, telling you about something, take what they say at face value. Only answer the questions they ask and give them an answer that just meets the requirements for giving them an answer. Don't go into any big explanations on anything, because that's where FDA gets an opportunity to start asking you questions about things they normally wouldn't because they don't know about them. So only keep your answers very simple, very straightforward, very direct answers to the questions.
Thank you. And the another one is, if an FDA inspector asks a question and the point of contact knows the answer, will the result in citation? How should they handle this?
Okay, yeah, if the FDA inspector asks you something, say they ask you for, did you evaluate your requirements for potential risk if they're not met? And suppose you didn't do the risk ratings for your requirements. The best option is to first say, well, here's the validation output. So you might want to look at that, but be honest. Don't try to cover up anything, because that's where the FDA starts to think you're really guilty of something and they're going to find you in out of compliance because of it. You're better off answering honestly. And even if they give you a 483 citation for something, you at least get to respond to that and remediate it within a certain amount of time. So it's like getting a speeding ticket that you can pay for. You want to make sure you don't just try to cover up something, because that's where the FDA starts to get wind that you're trying to cover up, and they're going to be relentless in trying to get information. Honesty is the best policy.
Thank you. So these were all the questions for today, Carolyn. I would like to turn back the program to you and any closing remark, and then we can conclude the session.
Sure. It's very important that if FDA is coming in and you try to get a scope memo up front to know what they're going to be looking at. And they say, we're going to come in and look at 2 of your systems. The first thing they're going to do is ask you for your GXP system inventory. And when you show them that, there's no guarantee they're going to pick the top 2 systems. You don't know what systems they're going to pick to audit. So you have to be prepared and have them all done equivalently, following the same similar approach to validation and having the documentation available. And it's also important that whoever's the point of contact knows all of these systems, where they are, who are the subject matter experts, were these vendor packages or homegrown or something else. They should be familiar enough with that inventory and how the validation was done to be able to answer questions, or at least find the person who can answer the questions. So the point of contact may not know exactly what this particular system does or how it was validated, but they should know who's using the system and be able to get some insight from that person. It's important to know the subject area as much as you can before FDA comes in, because that's how you're prepared and you can respond more effectively. Get them the answer right away. If you stall on getting them an answer, then they tend to start adding more questions, filling the vacuum of space by asking you more questions. You don't want to be in that position where you're kind of on the defense. So give them what they need, be able to at least provide them with something, and move on.
Thank you, Carolyn, for this amazing webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a conclusion for today's webinar titled Mastering FDA Computer System Audit, Best Practice for Preparation. To disconnect, you can simply hang up. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.